June 8th, 1989. Richmond, British Columbia. After disappearing for 2 weeks, the body of 44-year-old Cindy James is found in the yard of an abandoned house. Her hands and feet have been tied behind her back, and her cause of death is determined to be an overdose. Cindy's death brings an end to a 6.5-year period of terror in which she claimed to have been stalked, tormented, and attacked by an unknown assailant. However, police believe that Cindy was a mentally ill person who staged all the attacks against herself before committing suicide. The conflicting evidence prompts a coroner's inquest, and the official ruling is that Cindy died of an unknown event. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and I hope that soundbite I just played did not give any of you folks a heart attack. In case you're wondering, that is a recording of an answering machine message from a raspy-voiced caller uttering the words, "Cindy, dead meat, soon." This message was left for the ex-husband of a woman named Cindy James, who was suffering through a years-long campaign of terror at this point. Was this caller the same person who had been terrorizing Cindy? Or was it actually Cindy herself disguising her voice? Well, that's a topic we're going to discuss on this episode. I've developed a special theme for the podcast this month. For the past few years, it's become an annual tradition for me to publish creepy Halloween-themed articles at crack.com. So for the entire month of October, all of the Trail Went Cold's episodes and minisodes are going to analyze cases which I have covered in my Halloween pieces at Cracked. Today's mystery was featured in my article 5 Creepiest Ways People Were Tormented for Years, which was published last October. And this is an ideal choice because the Cindy James case just happens to be one of my most requested mysteries to cover on this podcast, and I've been itching to do it for a long time. Of course, as you may or may not know, The Trail Went Cold is a Canadian-produced podcast, and this is one of our country's most infamous mysteries. It is undoubtedly one of the most memorable, creepy, and hotly debated cases ever featured on Unsolved Mysteries. The idea of a woman being constantly stalked and harassed for nearly 7 straight years is absolutely terrifying. In today's internet age, harassment campaigns are sadly all too common, as it's easy to make someone's life a living hell when you can do so anonymously from your keyboard. But in the pre-internet world of the 1980s, it would take an insane amount of time and effort to harass someone as much as Cindy James was harassed. However, there's also the possibility that Cindy James was a mentally ill woman who staged all the harassment against herself, which would also take an insane amount of time and effort on her part. I think the most unsettling aspect of this story is that no matter which side you take, both scenarios are frightening as hell. But before we get started, let's take a brief moment to get some business out of the way. The Trail Went Cold is now a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes like this one and 10 to 15-minute minisodes about smaller-scale cold cases which don't have as much material to explore. So we have entered the cycle of delivering either a new regular episode or minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. If you give us a rating or a review at any of these sites, you're opening the door for us to get more exposure and garner us some potential new listeners. The Trail Went Cold now has its own PayPal account and a new donate button on the website for anyone who's feeling generous. If there's anyone else out there who feels like making a donation, we would be incredibly flattered and greatly appreciate it. And we'll be sure to give any of our generous donors a shout out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let's begin the terrifying and baffling story of Cindy James. Our story begins in October of 1982 in Vancouver, British Columbia. Our central figure is 38-year-old Cindy James, who was still living under her birth name, Cindy Hack, at that time. Cindy has recently gotten separated from her husband, a psychiatrist named Roy Makepeace. The couple originally got married when Cindy was 22 years old and Roy was 18 years her senior. Cindy seemed quite content to end the marriage and move on with her life, but she would soon begin an unimaginable downward spiral. Approximately 4 months after the separation, Cindy started receiving a series of harassing phone calls from an unknown individual. Sometimes the caller would stay silent, and sometimes Cindy could hear a male voice whispering some threats. Cindy claimed she did not recognize the voice and reported those calls to the police. But in the ensuing months, the harassment would extend beyond the telephone and get much worse. Cindy often heard what she thought were prowlers outside her house. She would frequently discover that her porch lights had been broken and her phone lines were cut. At one point, she had a rock thrown through her window, and on another occasion, someone actually came into her home and slashed a pillow. Cindy then started finding creepy notes on her porch and in her mail. You can see some of these notes on the Unsolved Mysteries website and MelanieHack.com, a website run by Cindy's sister, Melanie Hack. These are the type of notes where individual letters would be cut out of magazines and glued onto a piece of paper to form sentences such as, "I see you," "Soon, Cindy," and "You're dead." They'd sometimes include photos of such unsettling images as a woman getting strangled, a corpse being wheeled into a morgue, and a hand holding a knife. It got to the point where Cindy started telling people that whoever was doing this wasn't trying to kill her, he was trying to scare her to death. And this is when the harassment against Cindy started escalating into violence. On the evening of January 27, 1983, one of Cindy's friends, Agnes Woodcock, arrived at her house, but Cindy didn't answer the door. Agnes soon discovered that Cindy was lying on the ground outside with a nylon stocking tied around her neck. Cindy claimed that she was going out to the garage and was attacked by an unknown assailant, but she didn't see anything but white sneakers. Of course, the police were notified, but this began what could best be described as a very frustrating relationship between Cindy and the authorities. Whenever Cindy described the attacks against her, the police always sensed that she was withholding information and knew more about who her attackers might be than she was letting on. Even Cindy's parents, Otto and Tilly Hack, suspected that she was being evasive. However, Cindy eventually shared a very disturbing story with her mother. Apparently, at one point, Cindy was attacked by someone who held a knife to her throat and told her that if she said anything, her sister and mother would be next. So this turned into a very strange situation. Whenever anything happened to her, Cindy did report it, but always gave off the impression that she wasn't telling the whole story, seemingly to protect her family. Over the course of the next few years, the forms of harassment became increasingly bizarre. At one point, Cindy's attacker apparently targeted her dog, Heidi, who was shaking with fright in her own feces with a cord tied around her neck. And over the course of 1 month, Cindy found a total of 3 dead cats in her yard. 2 of them were strangled, and 1 of them had been hit by a car. The first cat had a cord around its neck, along with a note that read, "You're next." And the next 2 dead cats, they also came with threatening letters. So since the police didn't prove to be much help for Cindy, she decided to hire a private investigator named Ozzy Caban to look into her case and watch over her from time to time. Since Cindy's phone lines often got cut, Caban decided to provide her with a 2-way radio to contact him in case of an emergency. Well, on the evening of January 30th, 1984, Caban heard some strange noises on the radio and ran to Cindy's house to investigate. He discovered her unconscious on the floor, and this time, a paring knife had been used to pin another creepy note to Cindy's hand, which read, "Now you must die, cunt." After Cindy got medical attention, she told everyone that she remembered seeing a man enter through her house's front gate before she was suddenly struck from behind on the head with an object, possibly a piece of wood. She then remembered someone holding her down and sticking a needle into her arm. So this seemed to imply that more than one person was involved in this particular attack. But here's the problematic part of her story. When Ozzie Caban ran up to Cindy's house, the front door was locked, and he only busted it down when he looked through the window and saw that Cindy was lying on the floor. Caban never actually saw any attackers, and there were no signs of forced entry into the house. So it was around this time period when the police started getting really suspicious. There would be this constant cycle where the police put surveillance on Cindy's house for days or weeks at a time, and nothing would happen. But lo and behold, whenever the police pulled their surveillance and left, Cindy would get attacked again almost immediately. Of course, Cindy and her family's response to this was that the police weren't exactly discreet with their surveillance, so whoever was attacking her knew she was being watched, and would wait until the police were gone before they struck again. But police still found it very troubling that they can never find any hard evidence which pointed towards a suspect. Cindy took a total of 3 lie detector tests while this was going on. On 2 of the tests, the results were inconclusive, but seemed to indicate that Cindy was being evasive. However, a 3rd test, which took place after the attack where she was stabbed through the hand, it indicated she was being truthful. During this time period, Cindy suffered a mental breakdown and would have a brief stay in a psychiatric hospital. On December 11th, 1985, Cindy disappeared and was found in a ditch 6 miles from her home. She had a black nylon stocking wrapped around her neck and was wearing a man's work boot and glove. There were cuts and bruises all over her body, and she nearly succumbed to hypothermia. However, when she recovered, Cindy claimed to have no memory at all of what happened. It was after this incident when Cindy started taking major steps to protect herself. She moved to a new house, painted her car, and changed her last name, so this is when Cindy Hack officially became known as Cindy James. But this would not bring an end to her problems. Cindy often had Agnes Woodcock and her husband Tom stay over at her house for protection, but this is when the next major incident happened. One night in April of 1986, Cindy woke up Agnes and Tom and told them she heard a noise downstairs. When they went downstairs, they discovered that the basement had been set on fire, so of course the police and the fire department were notified. But on this particular occasion, there were 2 strange details which really set off alarm bells for the police. Number 1, there were no signs of forced entry at all into the home. In fact, there was undisturbed dust and fingerprints on the outside windowsill. The evidence clearly pointed to someone inside the home starting the fire. And number 2, on this particular night, Cindy had decided to go outside alone to walk her dog at around 3 a.m., which is a very strange thing to do when someone has been constantly attacking you for 3 straight years. But on the other hand, this was one of the very few incidents in which another witness besides Cindy could actually report the presence of another individual. Per usual, Cindy's phone line was cut, so Tom Woodcock had to leave the house and go to a neighbor to call the fire department. When he ran outside, Tom claimed he saw a man standing on the curb. Tom asked him if he would call the fire department, but this guy just ran off and no one ever saw him again. In spite of this, however, police seemed pretty certain that Cindy had set fire to the basement, and now started to seriously wonder if she had staged every single one of the alleged attacks on herself. Whatever the truth, this incident took such a toll on Cindy that she tried to starve herself to death and had to be committed to a psychiatric ward once again. This time, Cindy's stay lasted for 10 weeks, and they started examining the possibility that Cindy was staging all of her attacks because she had some sort of multiple personality disorder. However, Cindy's psychotherapist did not believe this was the case, as he even put her under hypnosis and saw no indication that she was suffering from MPD. He believed that Cindy was genuinely terrified about what was happening to her, and the fact that people were now disbelieving her story seemed to have a serious effect on her mental health. At one point, she wrote a note which said, "I still feel suicide is my best option in an unbearable situation, and as soon as I get out of here, I will carry out my plan." Cindy was finally released from the hospital, but she did not commit suicide. After the incident with the fire, she was kicked out of her house by her landlord and forced to move into a new place again. It was around this time when Cindy finally admitted to her family that she had been withholding information and thought she knew who the perpetrator was. Cindy didn't go into specifics, but she started accusing her ex-husband, Roy Makepeace, of being her tormentor. And I'm sure that thought has probably entered your mind already, given that all the harassment against Cindy began only a few months after they separated. But what's interesting is that the separation was pretty amicable. Cindy and Roy actually remained fairly good friends until they quietly divorced without incident a few years later. The police encouraged Cindy to phone Roy and confront him with her accusations while they taped their conversation, but Roy never said anything incriminating and flat out denied being responsible. Shortly thereafter, Roy received his own creepy anonymous answering machine message, where the raspy-voiced caller exclaimed, "Cindy, dead meat, soon." Of course, that is the exact soundbite you heard at the beginning of this episode. However, when police listened to the message, they believed it was Cindy disguising her voice. On October 26, 1988, 2 weeks after Roy received the message, Cindy suffered yet another attack of physical violence, as she was found unconscious in her car in a hog-tied position with her hands and feet tied behind her back. She was naked from the waist down, and once again she had a nylon stocking tied around her neck. And of course, she had no memory about what actually happened to her. Throughout the decade, Cindy worked at a preschool, and her job involved working with children who had emotional and behavioral issues. As you can imagine, Cindy's ongoing problems eventually made her employee feel she should not be working with children, so she was forced out of this position. Cindy wound up getting a new job as a nurse, a field she had not worked in for several years at this point. Anyway, the total number of incidents that Cindy reported throughout the decade was nearly 100. But after 6.5 years of non-stop torment, Cindy James' life finally came to an end. On May 25, 1989, Cindy disappeared after going to a shopping mall to deposit a paycheck. Her abandoned vehicle was found in the parking lot with groceries and a wrapped gift inside. There was blood on the driver's side door, and items from Cindy's wallet were scattered underneath the car. Cindy would be a missing person for 2 weeks, until a construction crew found her partially decomposed body on June 8th in the yard of an abandoned house, which was located a mile away from the mall. Much like her attack from October of 1988, Cindy's hands and feet were bound behind her back, and she had a nylon stocking wrapped around her neck. The cause of death was an overdose, as an autopsy would find traces of morphine and a sedative called flurazepam in her system. Cindy had apparently taken about 10 times the lethal amount of both these drugs. By this point, police were so certain that Cindy had staged all the attacks against herself that they ruled her death as suicide, but not surprisingly, her family and friends disagreed. As a result, a coroner's inquest was held to determine whether Cindy's death was suicide or foul play. It lasted over 3 months, and over 80 witnesses were called to testify. This included 3 different psychiatrists, including Roy Makepeace, and they all came to different conclusions. Roy believed Cindy was probably suffering from multiple personality disorder, another psychiatrist felt it was hysterical personality disorder, and the third one thought she was suffering from borderline personality disorder, with features of post-traumatic stress disorder. Because of the state of decomposition on Cindy's body, it was impossible to conclusively determine how the drugs entered her system, which is unfortunate because figuring out whether the drugs were ingested or injected would be a major piece of this puzzle. Flurazepam is a drug which can only be taken orally, and a toxicologist believed that she likely took around 80 tablets. Morphine is a drug which can either be injected or taken in tablet form. And since she was working at a hospital, Cindy would have had access to both those drugs at that time. Now, there appeared to be a needle mark on Cindy's arm, but there was no sign of a syringe or any sign of drinking device at the scene which she could have used to take these drugs. Obviously, Cindy's family found it unlikely that she could have hog-tied herself on her own, but they found it particularly hard to believe that she would have been able to take all those drugs and been able to tie herself up into that difficult position before she died. The police countered with a knot specialist who demonstrated that he could tie himself up in that position with the exact same type of knots in 3 minutes. So if Cindy ingested all those drugs, she theoretically could have had enough time to tie herself up before they took full effect. But the key word here is ingested. If Cindy took all those drugs orally, then yes, she probably would have had around 15 to 20 minutes to tie herself up. But if the morphine was injected directly into her bloodstream, then she likely would have been rendered unconscious immediately before she died. So the problem was that they could not establish how the morphine entered Cindy's system. In the end, there just wasn't enough evidence to sway the jury for the inquest in either direction. So their very anticlimactic determination was that Cindy James died of an unknown event. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So unfortunately, there really haven't been any developments in this story within the past 27 years. Of course, the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, and if you go to YouTube, you can also watch segments about it on A Current Affair and the Canadian news magazine show W5. There have been 2 books published about the case. One of them, titled The Deaths of Cindy James, was written by Vancouver Sun reporter Neil Hall. The other book was called Who Killed Cindy James, and was written by journalist Ian Mulgrew, who was working at the Globe and Mail at that time, and took the viewpoint that Cindy staged everything herself and committed suicide. Neil Hall has also gone on record as saying he believes the same thing about Cindy, but he keeps his personal opinions out of his book, so The Deaths of Cindy James is a more unbiased, straightforward account of the events. Cindy's sister, Melanie Hack, has also written a manuscript titled Who Killed My Sister, My Friend, The Cindy James Story, which was supposed to be published into a book, but as far as I can tell, it never has, and I'm not sure it ever will. Years ago, Melanie visited the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and posted under the handle Purple Rose to share personal insights about the case. Sadly, both of Cindy's parents, Otto and Tilly Hack, have passed away in recent years. But given the notoriety surrounding this case, there's surprisingly not a lot of information about it available online. The primary resources are the Unsolved Mysteries website and Melanie Hack's website, but there aren't many media articles to be found. However, in 2013, Cindy's story was published in a special issue of Maclean's magazine about unsolved Canadian mysteries. But the case is still widely discussed amongst true crime buffs, and opinions on it are sharply divided, and it's easy to see both viewpoints here. It is very strange that Cindy could suffer through this for 6.5 years and report nearly 100 incidents, yet no hard evidence ever surfaced which pointed to a suspect. Yet it's also very strange that Cindy could stage nearly 100 incidents and keep this up for 6.5 years without getting caught. When you consider the amount of time and effort it would require for Cindy to orchestrate the whole thing herself, it's pretty astonishing that she never left behind any hard evidence to prove this was a hoax. And herein lies my major problem with the police investigation. I can certainly understand their frustration and why it must have seemed suspicious that they could devote so much time and resources to watching her and nothing would ever happen. But if Cindy was faking the whole thing, it seems to me there should have been a simpler way to prove that. Since a lot of these incidents seem to happen right after the police pulled their surveillance offer, I don't see why they couldn't have tried something more covert. If you're so certain this is a hoax, the obvious solution would be to tell Cindy that you're pulling all the surveillance offer, but then continue watching her discreetly without letting her know. If Cindy believed the police were gone and started staging some attacks again, then boom, they've caught her in the act. Or maybe her attacker returns and they catch him in the act instead. There's no guarantee this plan would have worked, but at the very least they should have tried it. But here's another complication involving the police. When Cindy started reporting the harassing phone calls back in 1982, the first police officer to investigate the matter was a constable named Patrick McBride, and he wound up getting romantically involved with Cindy. In fact, McBride even moved in with her for a brief period, but the relationship ended when he asked Cindy to marry him, and she was just not ready for that. The whole situation is pretty strange, but it should be said that McBride was one of the only police officers who believed Cindy's stories and supported her. At one point, McBride actually monitored one of the weird phone calls Cindy received. The caller never said anything, but McBride claimed he did hear what sounded like a woman's voice on a public address system in the background. Naturally, McBride was looked at as a possible suspect, and he was cleared, but there's an unsettling postscript to this story. 4 years after Cindy's death, McBride pleaded guilty to 2 separate incidents of sexually assaulting women, which took place in 1989 and 1991. And apparently, McBride told one of the victims that she reminded him of Cindy James. At his trial, McBride claimed that the stress of Cindy's death was a contributing factor in these incidents, and that his affair with Cindy had a negative effect on his police career. It also turned out that he had been under psychiatric care since 1984 because of a personality disorder. In the end, McBride received a 1-year jail sentence and 2 years probation for these assaults. I don't know if McBride's issues have any significance to Cindy's case, but they just add an extra element of weirdness to the whole story. And now I'm going to talk about another potential suspect. I mentioned earlier that Cindy accused her ex-husband Roy Makepeace of being her tormentor, but police never found any evidence to suggest he was responsible, and he was even out of the country when one of Cindy's major attacks took place. However, during one of her posts at the Unsolved Mysteries message board, Melanie Hack displayed a bizarre email she once received from someone who claimed that shortly before Cindy and Roy got separated, they both took a boat to the Gulf Islands to visit a psychiatrist named Dr. James Tyhurst. Well, this Dr. Tyhurst is a real piece of work. As it turned out, he was sexually abusing some of his female patients. Because of this, he was arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in November of 1989, just 4 months after Cindy's death. In 1991, Tyhurst was convicted on 5 counts of sexual and indecent assault and received a 4-year prison sentence. However, he appealed that sentence and was awarded a new trial in which he was acquitted. But in 2001, he was taken to civil court in order to pay $557,000 in damages to one of his victims. Well, it's been speculated that something happened during Cindy's trip to the Gulf Islands, and I've seen a few unsourced claims on message boards that Cindy told someone she witnessed her husband and Dr. Tyhurst cutting up and disposing of some dead bodies. There are also reports that Tyhurst worked with the CIA during the 1950s to participate in experiments involving brainwashing. So one of the most outrageous theories out there is that Tyhurst used some sort of brainwashing or mind control techniques on Cindy to slowly drive her insane. The emailer who contacted Melanie also thinks there's some significance to Cindy deciding to change her last name to James, since that happened to be Dr. Tyhurst's first name. Now, Roy Makepeace and James Tyhurst were on the faculty of the University of British Columbia during the 1960s, so they were colleagues and likely knew each other. But there is no evidence that Tyhurst knew Cindy or that this alleged boat trip to the Gulf Islands actually happened. It's undeniable that Tyhurst was a sexual deviant and a creep. But until I hear some hard evidence that he ever crossed paths with Cindy, I will not consider him a suspect. I also have my doubts that Roy Makepeace orchestrated all these attacks on Cindy. Roy passed away of cancer in 2013, so if he actually did know something, he took those secrets to his grave. So now that we've looked at the potential suspects, let's examine the possibility that Cindy James did all this to herself. In some of the attacks against her, there are some signs which point to her staging the whole thing. I'm kind of on the fence about the incident where the note was pinned to her hand. It's hard to fathom a woman willingly stabbing a knife through her own hand like that, but it's also strange that she was found inside her house with the front door locked and there were no signs of forced entry. The incident with the fire in her basement is probably the most suspicious one, as it seems very unlikely that anyone broke into the house that night, and the most logical scenario is that Cindy started the fire herself. But on the other hand, what was the deal with the man Tom Woodcock saw outside, who just ran away when Tom asked him to call the fire department? I guess it's possible that he was just some random guy passing through the neighborhood who didn't want to get involved and took off, but it seems like a pretty weird coincidence. Now, there is at least one more documented case of a witness seeing an unknown individual standing outside Cindy's house. Years earlier, one of Cindy's neighbors claimed he saw a man standing in his yard, staring at Cindy's house. When the neighbor asked the man what he was doing there, the guy took off immediately. I don't believe this sighting took place around the same time as any of Cindy's reported incidents of harassment, so it's unknown if this man had any connection to her at all. But yeah, over the course of 6.5 years and nearly 100 incidents, 2 independent sightings of a possible suspect seems pretty underwhelming. But it must be said that there were a few incidents where it seemed outright impossible that Cindy could have staged things. I mentioned earlier that Pat McBride personally monitored one of the strange phone calls Cindy received. While there were a few more incidences where Cindy got calls while other witnesses were present, including her sister Melanie, Ozzy Caban, and another police officer. Now, in those particular cases, the caller never actually said anything, and there was nothing but silence on the line. But that doesn't change the fact that Cindy couldn't have been phoning herself, so at the very least she was receiving weird calls for a time. Whether the person who made these calls escalated into threats and physical violence is unknown. It should be mentioned that whenever Cindy received any of these calls, they were always too short to trace. And there was also one more incident where Cindy was playing cards at her home with Agnes and Tom Woodcock, and her burglar alarm went off. They then discovered that the glass window from Cindy's basement door had been removed, but the Woodcocks verified that Cindy was with them at the precise moment the alarm went off, so she couldn't have done this herself. Compared to some of the other stuff Cindy went through, the silent phone calls and the incident with the burglar alarm were relatively minor. But if there was someone else orchestrating this, it's almost like they calculated things so that the very worst incidents occurred while no one else was around. But before I share my personal thoughts, I have to address the problematic issues surrounding Cindy's disappearance and the eventual discovery of her body. Whether you believe Cindy was murdered or committed suicide, it seems very unlikely that her body could have been in the yard of that abandoned house during the entire 2-week period she was missing. During the W5 segment, Ozzy Caban actually took the film crew out to that location and pointed over to the nearest road. You could clearly see that Cindy's body would have been lying out in the open and that traffic was constantly passing by, so it seems unfathomable that she could go unnoticed for 2 whole weeks. That's why Caban is insistent that her body was dumped there. And here's an interesting tidbit. There was actually a man who lived near the abandoned house in a blue van for about 3 weeks prior to Cindy's body being discovered. He claimed that he never noticed her body or detected any rotting smell, and he had no idea that Cindy was even there until the police arrived. This abandoned house was also frequently used as a partying spot for high school kids, and it turned out that at least one party had taken place in that house during the time Cindy was missing. Yet no one reported seeing anything. Now, Cindy's body was in a state of decomposition, so she had to have been dead for at least some time before she was found. But if her body had been lying outside for 2 straight weeks during May and June, the decomposition would have been much, much worse. At the coroner's inquest, an entomologist testified that Cindy's body had likely been at the scene since around June 2nd, which was 6 days before she was found. But if true, that's still 1 full week where her whereabouts are unaccounted for. And there's also the fact that blood was found on the driver's side door of Cindy's vehicle. You'd assume the blood was Cindy's, but I'm not sure if they did any test to officially confirm that. But did Cindy really cut herself and smear her own blood on her car in a public parking lot? And if so, how did she treat the wound after she went missing? And if she was deliberately staging her own disappearance, where was she hiding out over the course of the next week or 2? I know it was impossible to determine the exact circumstances of how all those drugs ended up in Cindy's system and caused her to overdose, but I think there's a serious flaw with the logic of using a knot specialist at the inquest to demonstrate whether or not Cindy could have tied herself into that position in the amount of time it took for the drugs to take effect. The key word here is not specialist. There is no indication that Cindy James was a knot specialist. So just because this specialist can tie himself up in 3 minutes doesn't mean that Cindy could do it. In fact, it's debatable whether Cindy could have tied herself up into a hog-tie position at all, with or without drugs in her system. So I don't put much weight in that demonstration, and there are still a lot of unanswered questions about Cindy's death. So was Cindy James murdered after being stalked for 6.5 straight years? Or did she stage the whole thing herself and commit suicide? Personally, I think the truth might lie somewhere in the middle. I do think it's likely that she staged some of the incidents, but not all of them. In fact, I'm inclined to think that the early incidents of harassment were real, and they took such a toll on her mental health that she wound up staging the attacks on herself as a response. It's possible that she became so frustrated by the police's inability to find the person responsible that she felt the need to fake some incidents in order to keep their attention focused on her. Whatever the real truth is, it's clear this woman was suffering. When you look at photos of Cindy when she's younger, she's a beautiful, vibrant woman who looks like she's full of life. It's quite jarring to compare them with photos of her from later in her life, as she looks absolutely drained, like she's enduring her own personal hell. I've pondered the possible mental disorder she might have been suffering from. I know Cindy's psychotherapist dismissed the possibility that she had multiple personality disorder, and I'm inclined to agree. None of Cindy's family or friends reported seeing any notable symptoms of this from her, and multiple personality disorder is not just something you can turn on and off at will. If Cindy had the disorder, she would have been unable to control it. It's likely that one of her alternate personalities would have surfaced while others were watching, but this never happened. It's also been theorized that Cindy was suffering from Munchausen syndrome, a disorder in which someone will fake trauma in order to garner sympathy and attention. I did suggest the possibility that Cindy did fake some incidents in order to attract the attention of the police, but if so, she likely did it as a desperation tactic because they were unable to stop her attacker. I don't think Cindy suddenly decided in 1982 that she was going to spend the next several years constantly faking harassment just for the purpose of getting attention. The one incident that I think most points to Cindy faking something is the creepy answering machine message to her ex-husband. The caller does sound a lot like a woman trying to disguise her voice, and I'd say there's a good chance it was Cindy. But in this particular case, it might have been a desperation tactic because she had just pointed the finger at Roy, and the cops couldn't find any evidence he was responsible. So this was her way of trying to make them think that someone else was still out there, trying to kill her. Did she also decide to stage the incident where she was found tied up in her car 2 weeks later? Hard to know for sure. Overall, I just don't think Cindy would have been capable of staging everything herself. When you consider the amount of time and effort it would have required for her to pull this off, it's pretty mind-blowing that she could do it for so long without getting caught. In spite of all her problems, it was not until 1988 when Cindy lost her job. I just don't know how she could have maintained steady employment and still found the time to orchestrate this elaborate hoax. And just as an example, what about the 3 dead cats which were found outside Cindy's house? Did she actually spend a bunch of time searching around for random cats to murder and then plant in her yard? But on the other hand, who else would have that kind of sick devotion to tormenting Cindy? Since Cindy sometimes describes seeing more than one attacker, were there actually multiple people out there dedicated to making her life a living hell? Why did Cindy often seem reluctant to provide more specific details and appear to be withholding information? It's certainly plausible that Cindy would remain silent about certain things if they threatened to harm her family, but if that's the case, why report these incidents to the police in the first place? I've always wondered if Cindy was on to something when she said that someone out there was not only trying to kill her, but trying to scare her to death. Since Roy Makepeace was a psychiatrist, one possible theory I've seen online is that he was attempting to use his ex-wife as a guinea pig in some sort of bizarre experiment. You've probably heard the term gaslighting, a form of psychological abuse where someone will deliberately manipulate a victim into questioning their own sanity. What if Roy wanted to drive Cindy insane by stalking and tormenting her for a while, before he stepped back and watched her destroy herself because of all the psychological abuse she endured? That sounds like a pretty compelling theory, but again, investigators found no evidence to suggest Roy was responsible, and since he and Cindy remained on good terms for a while after their separation, I see no motive for him to do this. And besides, Roy would have been in his mid-50s, early 60s around this time when these incidents took place. There were times when it seemed like Cindy's attacker had these ninja-like abilities to appear and disappear at will, and I don't think a man Roy's age would be capable of that. So unfortunately, if any of these attacks against Cindy were real, I really have no idea who could be responsible. I suppose it's possible that there was some random creeper out there who became fixated on Cindy and started off with some smaller scale harassment like obscene phone calls and prowling around her house, but then these things just did something to Cindy's mental state and caused her to snap, and the end result was her inflicting harm on herself. However, that still doesn't resolve a lot of the issues surrounding Cindy's actual death. I have to admit that I've always been on the fence about whether it was murder or suicide. If she had 80 tablets of flurazepam in her stomach, then that would point to it being an intentional overdose. Forcing someone to take that many pills just seems like a really bizarre way to kill someone. And unless Cindy's murderer just happened to be a medical professional, it seems unusual that they would even have flurazepam in their possession. Since Cindy worked at a hospital, all signs seem to point to Cindy stealing the drugs from her workplace, staging her own disappearance, and committing suicide. But there's still the uncertainty about whether Cindy could have tied herself up, and the improbability that her body was in that yard during the entire 2 weeks she was missing. So I started brainstorming a different scenario. What if Cindy did stage her own disappearance and was hiding out at someone else's place for a week or so? She then overdoses, and the person she's staying with decides to dump her body at that location. But of course, if that's the case, why would this person go to the trouble of tying her up like that? The crime scene is such a weird enigma, as it seems to point to a combination of suicide and the involvement of a second person. Could Cindy have committed an assisted suicide with someone else? Maybe, but I just have no idea who else could be involved. Overall, I'm still leaning towards the theory that Cindy was legitimately stalked and attacked for a while, but suffered some sort of mental breakdown which led to her staging some of the later incidents herself. I know this might sound like a cop-out, but I'm still undecided about whether her death was murder or suicide. But at the very least, there had to be another person involved. But I will say that if Cindy somehow staged all the incidents herself and her entire ordeal was a hoax, I still feel immense sympathy for her. People who orchestrate hoaxes often do so because they relish the attention, but that was clearly not the case with Cindy. She was definitely suffering and going through her own personal hell, and I'm sure even the most skeptical person would agree that she was not garnering any enjoyment out of this situation. I can understand how difficult this whole ordeal must have been for Cindy's family, and it's easy to see why they've always pushed so hard to make everyone believe that Cindy's death was murder, because that's the only way they'll ever receive some sort of closure. Because if there's no bad guy here, and Cindy was just a mentally ill woman who staged the whole thing herself, then there's no way we can ever know that for sure. But for their sake, I hope that Cindy's family are able to learn the truth someday and receive closure. So that's about it for this episode. Should you have any information about what happened to Cindy James, or if you know for certain that she was a victim of foul play, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit and the aforementioned Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum. And I also need to give my first shout out to the Spot in the Road, a new Facebook group where I hang out with some of the regular posters from that message board and discuss Unsolved Mysteries cases like this one. I hope you guys enjoyed this particular episode because this is definitely one of our most highly discussed cases. I also need to send out a big thank you to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and is the managing editor of The Back Row, the website which hosts this very podcast. And of course, a big shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't done so already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website. So if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. You can also check out my true crime and mystery articles at crack.com and listverse.com, and there's plenty of other non-true crime content you can find right here at The Back Row. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for another Halloween-themed minisode of The Trail Went Cold.